Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. So I'm back talking more about Beacon, New York, which I visited last month. And last week I talked about Mount Beacon, kind of the stories about the ruins there, a little paranormal investigation I tried out there. And this week I want to talk about what for me for the Beacon trip was like the creme de la creme, the most exciting, crowning glory of the trip that I was looking forward to the most, which is Bannerman's Castle, which is located on Polypel Island in the Hudson River, pretty close to Beacon. The island is also sometimes called Bannerman Island or Bannerman's Island because the Bannermans used to own the island. So I'll talk all about the history and the ghost stories tied in with this island. And I'll also talk a little bit about what it was like taking a tour there. So today, if you want to visit, you either have to kayak out there on your own, which people do, though kayakers are always far braver than I think I would ever be. But I think the way most people go there is a tour and cruise out to the island that the Bannerman Castle Trust runs, and they're the folks who are kind of trying to preserve the island and the castle and tell its history. So it's a short boat ride, less than half an hour, I would say. It's a short ride. And one interesting thing that the captain of the boat was talking about was that apparently on the Hudson River, back when steamboats were really big, steamboats used to race, basically, up and down the Hudson because whoever's steamboat was the fastest would get the most passengers, and apparently the newspapers would print updates about, how quickly different steamboats could go different places. But that's extremely dangerous because, steam engines have a tendency to explode when pushed too far. I don't know a lot about physics, so I'm sure I'm misrepresenting that a little bit, but basically these steamboats would explode and sink. Obviously not all of them, but a lot of them. And so the captain was saying that the bottom of the Hudson River all along there is just littered with these old steamboats that had been sunk. And he said even though there's tons and tons of them, you can't find the wrecks on any maps because the powers that be, whoever manages maps and stuff, I don't know if that would be the Coast Guard, but basically the authorities don't want people to know where all these wrecks are because they don't want people diving on the wrecks. So basically there's a steamboat graveyard all along the Hudson, and you don't really know where these boats exploded and sank, but that's just one thing I wanted to say to help you paint a picture in your mind palace of what this place is like. Also, the area is called like the Hudson Highlands or the Hudson Valley. And, I talked about Mount Beacon last time. There's tons of mountains everywhere. So you really are in like a valley. I guess it's technically a fjord because of how the glaciers carved it out. But you're in this place that is really beautiful. It looks magical. And, there's cities along the Hudson, but there's also tons and tons of hiking. So you take this boat from Beacon to the island, going through this, beautiful scenery. And then you get off and there's a walking tour that you can take. That was really interesting. And they just, walk you around the island. You can't get too close to the ruins of the castle because they are not stable and it could be potentially very dangerous. But it's a really cool tour, even though I was exhausted when I did the tour because I did it the same day that I woke up at 4:30 and got out early and went up on Mount Beacon. Then I had to rush to catch this boat. So I was exhausted and it was extremely hot and humid. And despite feeling like I wanted to collapse, I had a really fun time on this tour. It was very cool. So another thing to know about Bannerman Island or Bannerman's Castle is it's only about, 50 or 60 miles away from Manhattan, and you can see it from the train. So last month I went up to Albany for a day to go to a party, and on the way up, I looked out the window and I saw the castle. And I had remembered reading about it on Atlas Obscura sometime last year, and I was so excited to get to see this castle from the train. And you can see it from the Amtrak and from Metro North. So commuter train and Amtrak. And I think for a lot of people, they see it going up and down the Hudson on the train. And it's sort of this site of a lot of, I don't want to say like daydreams that people have, but you're going through this beautiful scenery on the train and you see this like crumbling castle on an island. And it just is such a romantic spot, like capital R romantic. And it's just really cool. It's this big, crumbling Scottish style castle that says on the side, Bannerman's Island Arsenal. And you can see that from the train. And it was a combination munitions warehouse and billboard, because, of course, you can see what it is from the train. And the island was abandoned around the 1950s, but before the island was abandoned and before the buildings on it were in ruins and before the buildings were built even, this island has a long history. Supposedly, the indigenous people who lived in the area had legends about the place. They supposedly avoided it after nightfall and would kind of just go there during the day. And there were also some ghost stories from the Dutch sailors later on who were afraid of goblins who supposedly would whip up these squalls and destroy ships. There are a couple stories behind why this island is called Polypel Island, and one of them is that it comes from a Dutch word meaning pot ladle, and it was a reference to drunken or boisterous sailors who would be put on the island, and then their boats would continue, and then the boats would swing back around and pick them up once they'd sobered up. An alternative to that story describes a sort of hazing situation where new sailors would be deposited there and then picked up later, and it would just be a creepy haunted island they had to hang out at. The other story is about a girl who lived in the area named Polypel, who had this sort of romantic story about her being rescued. The island has a little bit of Revolutionary War history. The Americans made a chevaux de frise, which was like a underwater fence made out of sharpened logs. And they were supposed to sink British ships, but it didn't work out. So, not the most successful Revolutionary War history, but it did have some history. The island was owned by some rich people later on, the Van Wicks and then the Tafts, and it was basically used as like a picnic ground, and it would be used for fishing. And in 1900, a man named Frank Bannerman purchased the island. So Bannerman was a surplus military goods dealer or surplus arms dealer. The tour guide told a lot of good stories about him being a shrewd businessman and, cheating his competitors or outsmarting his competitors. And sounds like he was a bit of a character. But he had this arms company, where he was buying up all these arms and he needed somewhere to store them. And he was storing them in New York City, in Brooklyn, I believe. And the tour guide explained that, it was the late 19th century. Brooklyn was, going to try to be incorporated into the rest of New York. So it would just be one big city. I think that was 1898 when that finally happened. And basically they were trying to clean up Brooklyn, make it more attractive, I guess, to the rest of New York. And basically they were like, you can't have a huge warehouse full of explosives in the middle of Brooklyn. So he needed a place to store all of these munitions. So he buys the island. He designed himself 7 different buildings for the island. There were 3 warehouses. There were a couple of houses for workers. There was a family residence for his family. And it's interesting because it sounds like he would just like go to Europe and see some castles and be like, I like that castle. And then he'd draw a picture of the castle and give it to people and tell them to build this thing he drew for him. And actually on the island in what used to be the family residence, there are some reproductions of some of the drawings he did of this castle he wanted built. It was kind of like, a Scottish style castle because he was Scottish. Apparently he was also influenced by Belgian castles. And he sounds like he was a quirky guy. He made up a coat of arms for the family, and he was very frugal. So like the tour guide was talking about how if they had some leftover cement from building something that day, he would just like go around and see what he could use that cement for. So the tour guide showed us like a little bench that he had made and like just random stuff he'd made, basically being like, well, I don't want this cement to go to waste. So sounds like he was really a character. He was an ultra wealthy dude and an arms dealer, so probably not the most scrupulous or likable character, but interesting. On the island, there were some amenities, like there was telephone service, there was indoor plumbing. The Bannermans would usually just go there like on weekends, and then there were some employees who lived there full time. But when people would want to visit the island, there would be a place on the eastern shore of the Hudson, right across from the island, and there was a brass bell there that they would ring. And the sound from the bell would travel, 1,000 feet to the island. And then employees on the island would bring the boats out to pick up the visitors. And a lot of the times the visitors had to bring water with them because the water was not potable on the island. So it wasn't the most luxurious thing. And as I was there on, a terrible, sticky, hot day in August, and I had actually run out of water and was very uncomfortable, I was like, yeah, I can see why the family stopped coming here once electricity and other comforts were more of a thing. But, it was a good idea for a place to store munitions. And it is cool that he built this warehouse in the shape of a castle. One interesting thing that they pointed out on the tour was that sometimes visitors from Europe will come and take the tour and be like, how come we have castles in Europe that are thousands of years old or like 1,000 years old? Whereas in America, your castles don't even last 100 years. And I thought that was an interesting question because there are tons of ruins around that are not very old in comparison to places in Europe. And the tour guide had an interesting answer, which is that, this was a warehouse. It wasn't built to be a fortified castle for like invading forces. It was made out of brick and cement, not huge slabs of stone. And it was really kind of for show. It was like a utilitarian thing with some fanciness on top. And it looks really cool and it looks like an old castle. So of course there's that impulse to be like, man, it really should have lasted longer. But I don't know, it seems very American that our versions of castles are falling apart very quickly. So that's the castle and sort of a brief summary of the history of the island. Now I want to look at some of the legends and supposed hauntings from the area. And before I get into that, I do want to say there is a great video on YouTube by Full Dark Paranormal Explorers. If you search that, it'll come up. And they did a really cool video about the island and the castle. So if you kind of want to see it visually, I think that episode that they did pairs really nicely with this episode. So you should definitely watch that after you're done listening to this. And one thing that they mentioned in the video is that there were stories of shadow people on the island. But there are tons of superstitions throughout history about this place, mostly from the Dutch. I found a 1996 New York Times piece called Bannerman's Folly, a Hudson Island haunted by goblins, that I wanted to read a bit from. and it talks about some more of the story behind the island's name, potentially, and also some more of the superstition. The early Dutch sailors who had to navigate the river believed this part of the highlands to be haunted by goblins, who were responsible for the murderous and sudden squalls that came out of nowhere and often sank their ships. They believed that once past the island, the ship was safe. The article goes on to talk about the pot handle, potential etymology for the island's name, and the potential practice of leaving drunk sailors there. But I want to read this bit of that. A variation on this lore has it that old salts purposely got first-timers drunk and put them ashore on Polypel to appease the awful Heer of Dunderberg, the goblin described by Washington Irving. Another legend refers to a young farm girl named Polly Pell, who lived nearby during the Revolution and was courted by her old schoolmate, Gert Brinkerhoff, and a refugee minister from British-held New York, Paul Vernon. Brinkerhoff took her for a sleigh ride on the ice, and Vernon, fearing the ice was unsafe, pursued them. He was right. He reached the pair just as the ice broke up. As the tide turned and began sweeping them downstream, Polly, who was sure that the end was near, confessed her love to Brinkerhoff. Vernon nobly married them on the spot, just before the current smashed their ice floe onto the island, which was named, when all were rescued, after Polly Pell. According to old river hands, during the awful squalls you can still hear orders being shouted by the captain of the Flying Dutchman, which, like many other vessels, sank south of the island in the early 1700s. In fact, the ruins as they now stand seem a fitting tribute to the Highlands' spooky legacy. Clearly, any new human effort here will have to contend with the Heer of Dunderberg. I'd never heard of this Heer of Dunderberg. Here's what I learned about him. So, the legends about him date to the days of Dutch New Amsterdam, what New York City used to be called, when there were stories of a mysterious ship that was not flying any flag that anyone could recognize, going up the Hudson, all the way from Gravesend Bay to the Hudson Highlands. He was mostly seen in the Highlands, and it was said that the ship was an omen or warning of death. If you tried to flag down the ship or get anyone to respond, you would not be successful. Some people attempted to shoot it with cannons, but the ball seemed to go right through without damaging the ship. Sailors would try to get close to the ship, which would disappear as soon as they neared it. The ship was usually seen by moonlight, and usually a huge storm would accompany it or happen right afterwards. And if the ship appeared heading straight for yours, you were supposedly doomed. And the idea is that the ship is the ghost of the Flying Dutchman, which sunk in a storm just south of Polypel Island, but other people say that it's the ghost of the Hall of Maine, which in English is Half Moon. And that was a ship that Henry Hudson, whose ghost has supposedly been seen further north near the Catskills, that was his ship. Also, supposedly Henry Hudson saw ghostly figures in the area as well when he was sailing, so lots of creepiness in this area, which it makes sense because it's, like I said, beautiful, capital R romantic, with these huge mountains and the valley, and it's misty and mysterious. Makes sense. So there's a website called Anomalien that had a good description of this ghost ship that I just wanted to read a little bit from. The Heer of Dunderberg was told to be a goblin king, and his army set about to bring his wrath of rain, wind, thunder, and lightning to sailors making their way up and down the Hudson, inexperienced sailors being the most likely victims. Dutch sailors would fasten horseshoes to their masts in an attempt to ward off the Dunderberg. Most sightings would occur near the shadows of the Dunderberg, a large mountain thought to be the dwelling place of the Goblin King. This mountain also marked the southern gateway to the Hudson Highlands, where the most treacherous encounters would occur. Sailors claimed to see a goblin-like figure when the biggest of storms hit. He was a plump, round fellow with a light-colored sugarloaf hat who was carrying a horn and would seemingly be shouting out orders commanding the gales and lightning. Some would tell tales of seeing the sugarloaf hat of the Storm King, as he became known by some, blow in from nowhere and land in the rigging of the ship. It would stay there until the ship passed out of the Heer of Dunderberg's domain, then blow away as if by some unseen hand. Then the skies would clear. The northern boundary, which marked safety, was just beyond Polypel Island. Some sailors reported seeing the storm ship lingering in anchorage at Polypel Island, which led them to believe that the island was the home harbor for the phantom ship. Some referred to this place as Dead Man's Isle. It became ritual at one point to leave a new sailor on the island on the voyage upriver and then pick him up again on the way back if he survived. If he did, then it was thought that the Hero of Dunderberg would leave him at peace during his future voyages up the river. Any attempts to inhabit this island have failed. The ruins of Bannerman Castle stand there as a testament to this. So, that's a little bit more information about the Hero of Dunderberg. The American writer Arthur Guterman, who published some books and poetry from the 19-teens into the 1940s and was known for writing funny poems, he wrote a poem called The Lord of the Dunderberg, which I wanted to read a little bit from. Basically, the poem describes a ship carrying rum being plundered by the goblins who took the alcohol. Goblin and kobold and elf and gnome riot and rollick and make their home, deep in the highlands where the Hudson glides, curving the sweep of his volumed tides, round wooded islet and granite base, down through the rush of the devil's race. Great is the prowess of goblin might, dread is the malice of troll and sprite. Chief of them all is the potent dwerg, here of the keep of the Dunderberg. Mountain and river obey his spell, e'en to the island of Polypel. Brooding he sits in the rugged glen, jealous of honor of sprites and men. Ye who would sail his dominions through, scatheless withhold not the homage due. Lower your peak and its flaunting flag, strike to the Lord of the Thunder Crag. So, skipping a little bit later into the poem, shrouding the vessel before they wist, streamed from the mountain a curling mist. Piercing the woof of that leaden veil, pelted and rattled the heavy hail. Hudson arose like a tortured snake, foaming and heaving, the thunder spake. Rolled from the hills, and the lightning played viciously red through the pallid shade. Oh, how the elements howled and wailed! Oh, how the crew of the Gertrude quailed, huddling together with startling eyes, for in the rack, like a swarm of flies, legions of goblins in doublet and hose gamboled and frolicked off Anthony's nose, while the shuddering masthead sat cross-legged, crowned with his steeple hat. Grinning with mischief, that potent dwerg, lord of the keep of the Dunderberg. Skipping a little bit further into the poem, skippers that scoff when the night is bright, heed ye this story of goblin might. Strange the adventures of barks that come, laden with cargoes of gin and rum, when the storm ship drives with her head to gale, and the corpse-like gleams in her hollow sail, when crow nest laughs in the tempest's hem, while lightnings weave him a diadem, when Storm King shouts through the spumy rack, and Bull Hill bellows the thunderback, beware the wrath of the mighty dwerg, strike flag to the Lord of the Dunderberg. So I just thought that poem was fun and kind of, silly in a delightful way. And I don't know, it almost gives me like a Lord of the Rings vibe, which that area kind of has a Lord of the Rings vibe, so it makes sense. There's a book called Myths and Legends of Our Own Land by Charles M. Skinner, which was published in the late 19th century. And I've talked about this book before. I think for the Hellgate episodes that I did, I referenced this book some. And this book talks about Dunderberg as well. So I just wanted to read a little bit of that. Dunderberg, Thunder Mountain, at the southern gate of the Hudson Highlands, is a wooded eminence chiefly populated by a crew of imps of stout circumference, whose leader, the Heer, is a bulbous goblin, clad in the dress worn by Dutch colonists 2 centuries ago, and carrying a speaking trumpet, through which he bawls his orders for the blowing of winds and the touching off of lightnings. These orders are given in Low Dutch, and are put into execution by the imps aforesaid, who troop into the air and tumble about in the mist, sometimes smiting the flag or topsail of a ship to ribbons, or laying the vessel over before the wind, until she is in peril of going on beam ends. At one time, a sloop passing the Dunderberg had nearly foundered, when the crew discovered the sugar-loaf hat of the Heer at the masthead. None dared climb for it, and it was not until she had driven past Polypel's Island, the limit of the Heer's jurisdiction, that she righted. As she did so, the little hat spun into the air like a top, creating a vortex that drew up the storm clouds, and the sloop kept her way prosperously for the rest of the voyage. The captain had nailed a horseshoe to the mast. The hat rogue of the Devil's Bridge in Switzerland must be a relative of this gamesome sprite, for his mischief is usually of a harmless sort, but to be on the safe side, the Dutchmen who plied along the river lowered their peaks in homage to the keeper of the mountain, and for years this was a common practice. Mariners who paid this courtesy to the hero of Dunderberg were never molested by his imps, though skipper Ulsticker of Fishkill, for all he had a parson on board, was once beset by a heavy squall, and the goblin came out of the mist and sat astraddle of his bowsprit, seeming to guide his schooner straight towards the rocks. The dominie chanted the song of St. Nicholas, and the goblin, unable to endure either its spiritual potency or the worthy parson's singing, shot upward like a ball and rode off into the gale, carrying with him the nightcap of the parson's wife, which he hung on the weathercock of Eospus steeple 40 miles away. So, one interesting thing that you've maybe noticed from this bit is that it feels like a lot of the lore and the stories of the hauntings come from this book, Myths and Legends of Our Own Land. And maybe it's reproduced elsewhere, but this seems like the oldest source I was able to find on a, cursory look. I didn't do a super deep dive into newspaper databases. I just did a quick look. So I point this out because I think that is important context to have when looking at hauntings and legends and that sort of thing. There's this question of where do legends begin? Did someone, in the 19th century make up a bunch of legends and they got repeated everywhere and became fact? I don't know. My guess is that there probably is, a history to these legends. It's probably not just in this book, but it feels like most of the sources from nowadays either draw from each other or draw from this. So, just worth noting. But let's go back to the hauntings at Bannerman Castle and the island itself. So, supposedly the explosion that ruined a lot of the castle was caused by a lightning strike, adding to the mythos of the island maybe being cursed. So, the website Anomalian, which I read a little bit from before, also has the story of this haunting, which I actually haven't seen many other places, though I'm sure if I did a deeper dive in newspaper archives, I'd probably find it. But to read a bit from that site, the property was protected by breakwaters, which were formed by the sinking of old barges and boats. There was a legendary tale that the tugboat captain of one of the boats requested that his prized vessel not be sunk in his presence, but before anyone knew it, the boat was sinking right before the former captain's eyes. The captain cursed Bannerman and swore revenge. It has been said that employees in the lodge often heard the ringing of the boat's bell at various times, signifying that the captain had returned to make good on his promise. So that's an interesting story. So to flesh out the timeline of the destruction of Bannerman's Castle a little bit more, and elaborate more on the island's potential curse and the destruction that's happened there. So in 1920, 20 years after Bannerman purchased the island, and 2 years after Bannerman had died, there was an explosion of 200 pounds of shells in the warehouse, which ruined part of the warehouse. There were also some other explosions and disasters. So I want to read a little bit from seakayaker.com, which has a good description of some of the island's disasters. The cannon being tested against the mountain jumped, and its shell went over the mountain and through a nearby barn. The workmen melting scrap put live ammunition in the melting pot with resultant disaster. The castle was often known to have as many as 15 flags flying around it. However, lightning struck down the flagpoles so frequently that it became impractical to replace more than a few of them. Then, on a hot August day in 1920, a tremendous explosion wrecked the arsenal. 200 pounds of powder and shells stored in a powder house exploded, heaving a barrage of brick, munitions, and equipment high into the summer sky. A 25-foot section of high stone wall was blown to the mainland, blocking the New York Central Railroad tracks. The castle was considerably damaged, while the tower, along with the corner of the island itself, were blown far out into the river. Cities and villages along the river between Hudson and Peekskill were shaken by the explosion, and hundreds of window panes were smashed. So that's a big explosion, right? So after that explosion in 1920, the business stayed in operation, though sales declined as the century wore on. In 1950, the Polypel, the ferry boat that took people from the shore to the island, sank. And after that, the island was basically vacant. In 1967, New York State bought the island and they started giving tours in 1968. Then in 1969, there was a fire that happened under suspicious circumstances. I would guess it's the work of vandals, though who knows? And that fire was really destructive. It ruined the floors and the ceilings of the structures. Prior to the fire, it sounds like they were in okay condition. And then after that, the island had to be closed to the public. It was just not usable and not safe, even for tours. And it wasn't until the 2000s, I want to say like around 2005, it wasn't until the 2000s that it was reopened for tours. And I know it kind of started out not doing very many tours and there were a lot of restrictions. And now there's a lot of tours there and they do different events like movie screenings, etc., etc. But after it was reopened for tours in 2009, a bunch of the castle collapsed. I read that it was like about 40% of the front wall and maybe 50% of the east wall. So basically now, what you've got is the castle part, which just has outer walls, many of which, or some of which have collapsed. There's no inner walls, there's no floors, no ceilings. It's really cool looking, but it definitely is falling apart. They've put up kind of some metal support struts or whatever. I don't know what the right word for it is, but it reminds me a lot of some of the metal support structure that is at the Renwick Smallpox Hospital near me on Roosevelt Island. So the ruins seem like they're still pretty precarious, though of course it's safe to visit. I just wouldn't be surprised if more of it collapsed. So there's one last tidbit about some of the bad things that happened around the island, which is in April 2015, a woman and her fiance kayaked out to the island, and her fiance never returned from that trip. After that, she was charged with his murder, and she did plead guilty to negligent homicide. So there's also a murder aspect to the island's recent history. So that's Bannerman Castle and Polypel Island. I really enjoyed both visiting it and also reading about some of the legend and folklore of the area, because I mentioned last episode, I really don't know much at all about New York State outside of the city, since I live in the city and it is sometimes a pain to get out of here. So I really enjoyed learning about all that. I hope you did too. I'll try to remember to post some pictures of the island to the show notes at buriedsecretspodcast.com. And I'll definitely post some pictures on Instagram as well, which is at Buried Secrets Podcast. Before I close the episode, a couple things I wanted to mention. So first, back in March, I guess, I talked a little bit about the Feminine Macabre, which is a journal of the paranormal for women and non-binary people. And I was in the first volume, which came out in March. I had an essay about the Hell Gate and some of the stories about that area. And the second volume of the Feminine Macabre just came out at the very end of August. I'm really excited to read it. The first volume had so much cool stuff. Like, people wrote stuff about hauntings and ghost hunting and some of their kind of like personal occult experiences, etc. I really recommend it. It is an awesome resource. And there was a lot of stuff that I read in volume 1 where I was like, I feel like I should have read that elsewhere. You know, like it felt like it filled in some gaps in just some things I'd been thinking about with regards to the paranormal. And I don't know, it's just like a really great resource, whether you're into paranormal investigation and hauntings, or if you're just interested in history and the paranormal. It's really cool. Really recommend it. So that was volume 1. You can get it off of Amazon, though you can also buy it from Amanda Woomer, who is the editor of the project and who put everything together. You can buy it from her Etsy shop. So if you go to Instagram, her handle is Spook Eats, and I know she has the info in her bio. And you can buy the first volume, you can buy the second volume now that it's out. I've got essays in both volumes, but much more importantly, there's just so much cool stuff. There's such diversity of thought and interest and stuff. And it's a really great thing for your shelf of paranormal investigation things. And then tangentially related to that, I was a guest on Haunted History Chronicles recently. Haunted History Chronicles is a really cool podcast. I think that the episode that I'm on drops the same day as this episode, so keep an eye out for that. I was on there with another person who was in both volumes of The Feminine Macabre, Amy from Full Dark Paranormal, which is the YouTube channel that I mentioned earlier that also had a video about Bannerman Castle. I really enjoyed the conversation. I had a really nice time as a guest on the podcast. And, if you want to hear what it's like when I try to talk not with a script, not where I can edit myself together and cut out my tangents and make myself sound a little bit smarter than I usually do, you can check that out. But if you don't listen to Haunted History Chronicles, I really recommend it. It is a really fun podcast. If you like Buried Secrets, you'll like Haunted History Chronicles. There are tons of cool guests that Michelle has on, and she's based in England, so there's a lot of focus on hauntings there. It's a really great listen, whether or not you listen to the episode that I am on, talking about the Feminine Macabre. So I think that's it. I think that's all I have to say for now. Like I said before, check out buriedsecretspodcast.com for show notes, sources, and I'll try to put some pictures in there. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review. That really helps people find it. And thanks so much for listening.